Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I'm here for my Day 3 overview and analysis of all 8 games that we got in our final, major day, I would say, of group stage here in the play-ins at Worlds. Obviously, still some really important games to come tomorrow, and, even throughout that, we might even be getting a bigger day if certain tiebreakers fall into place, but the last official 8-game day on the docket here, and a lot of games that were very interesting to talk about. I honestly thought that today was going to be probably the least interesting and the least important of the 3 days that we had gotten so far, but we certainly did not get that. Some really interesting games, mostly because we got some really interesting results. Some things were locked in, and some things were flipped on their heads, but before we jump into anything like that, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of day number 3. A lot of really, really fun games that I'm excited to talk about. What was your favorite of the day? What was your least favorite? What team surprised you the most in a good and a bad way? I love hearing you guys' opinions on the day as a whole down below. And another just little small disclaimer at the beginning. If my voice sounds just a tad bit different, obviously we've been recording a ton of stuff every single day up until 4 in the morning. I also watch all of these games and I try to interact with people while watching them as well to make sure I get everything that I need to, and that leads to a lot of talking around the World's time, so if my voice sounds a little bit different in this video, I do apologize if there's maybe a few more cuts here or there for me to kind of catch my breath and get my voice back on track. I do apologize for that, but that's kind of the consequence of these podcast-style videos. But let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into the beginning of day number 3 here. And we kicked off day number 3 with maybe the most exciting game of the day, at least in terms of outcome. Everybody was looking towards this as a no-brainer, easy pick with how both of these teams have been playing so far, me included, and all of that got flipped on its head as we had the 1-2 Loud team taking on the 3-0 Fnatic team, and Loud was incredibly able to pick up a gigantic win for themselves here. Now, not saying that this is going to be gigantic for Loud in general, although it does put them in a pretty decent position depending on what happens tomorrow for them to be able to get the 3 seed in this group, which would be absolutely huge. But for Fnatic, this loss is absolutely ginormous. This kind of evens the scales in the group again. If both themselves and Evil Geniuses win out from here on out, they're going to have to play a tiebreaker for first place. They no longer have that in the bag because the tiebreaker system is, if you have the same record, you have to play a tiebreaker game. Head-to-head will determine side selection for that, of course, but Fnatic might still have to play another game to confirm their spot into the main group stage, and that's not where they were looking at all through the first 2 games. They looked ridiculously dominant, and they just couldn't quite keep up in this one. But for Loud's credit, they played this game basically perfectly. What a phenomenal game from them. First of all, love the draft. You've got aggressive pieces, but you also have things that are going to be incredibly effective towards the back half of the game. If I did have a little bit of a worry, it's that maybe the damage wasn't going to be ridiculously high. In the end game, you don't really have a quote-unquote hyper carry on your team, but that's okay because you're going into Caitlyn, and you can really afford to not have a hyper carry when you're going into an AD carry that really isn't going to scale in that way anyways. So you go for the MF Amumu, a really, really strong bot lane, especially if you're able to get the combo off. Obviously, everyone knows how I feel about Aatrox, Maokai, Sylas. Super into all 3 of those picks. Speaking on Sylas for a bit, we're going to see him throughout the day be by far the highest priority mid laner in the game right now, and obviously he got nerfed going into this tournament. I still had him as one of the tier 1 mids, but I did say he might fall in prio just because of the nerfs, but overall, it looks like he's in a very similar spot to what he was throughout most of the split. And if you recall from a lot of my analysis, Sylas was by far the best mid lane champion this year for pretty much every team in the world. He was always the champion I was recommending you go to if you can pull off the melee mid strategy, the shove and roam, because he scales super well and he can pseudo carry the game in the back half, more so than someone like Taliyah, in my opinion, and so very, very much understand seeing him. It definitely seems that other teams have picked up the Akali idea as well. Another thing that I've been heavily pushing on this channel is Akali over LeBlanc. I really have not understood the priority on LeBlanc over Akali. Akali just kind of does what LeBlanc does better right now. She has significantly more damage, and the survivability is relatively equal as long as you are good on the champion. So it's good to see a lot of my meta predictions really coming full circle here, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But for Loud, Really do like this comp. It gives you a lot of options. Obviously, Fnatic's going to want to try and play through that bot lane. That's what you do when you draft a Caitlyn. You want to try and play through that, but they have damage threats in both of the solo lanes here with Wunder on the Fiora, Humanoid on the Akali, and so you really have to make sure that if you're going to try and stop a lot of this bot lane aggression, you're not overextending and putting yourself in bad positions. And overall, I thought Loud navigated the early game perfectly. There were a lot of skirmishes, especially towards the bottom side of this map. Some that led Croc into getting a lot of gold here, and a lot that were leading into Brance getting a lot of gold on this misfortune. And there's really no way to talk about this game without at least kind of mentioning Brance here on the MF. Obviously, he played great, but what an awesome moment. The viral clip of him getting that brush kill with Seos flash ulting Upset and Hylissang and just raw killing him with ultimate. Great play from both of them, only for him to roll up his sleeve and have bot gap written on it while he flexes. Like, I mean, those are the kinds of moments in esports that we love. We live for that, especially, like, I imagine European fans. I know it sucks to have that done to you, but, like, that's awesome, and I love to see players have this kind of personality. It makes the team so much easier to root for and so much easier to cheer for in the long run, and Loud definitely feels like that right now. They feel like the feel-good team of group stage. There were a lot of other teams that I really do enjoy. Obviously, I'm a huge DRX fan, at least in terms of how this team plays, but it is really difficult to not cheer for Loud just because of how fun these players are, and Brance really embodies that. But it's not just his play style that is fun. He has been really a lightning bolt for Loud the entire year. Going into this tournament, I talked about how Brance was kind of the focal point for a lot of what this team wanted to do throughout the early game, and honestly, that has very much come true. They love to play aggressive in this 2v2. They love to try and generate a lead and then take advantage of that by moving it into other parts of the map, and Brance does such a great job of not getting caught in the mid to late game that they can really invest a lot into him without worrying too much that it's going to go wrong. Croc does a really phenomenal job in this game on the Maokai, who's definitely been a pick that has been prioritized significantly more in the jungle. I still think he's a very good top laner, but I do understand why the jungle presence has been so amazing. The amount of map control that you can generate with Maokai is unmatched. It's genuinely unmatched, and that's kind of why we're seeing it rise to the #1 jungle popularity kind of pick at Worlds so far, and I definitely agree with that. Even if I expected him to be the #1 top laner, for him to be the #1 jungler is certainly not a surprise to me. He had a great game. Croc played genuinely phenomenally here. He absolutely bodied Razork in the jungle matchup. This was not even remotely close. Crockett wasn't someone that I was super excited about. He's had some good games here or there in the playoffs, but wasn't someone that was like blowing me away. He was a big reason why I wasn't super sold on Loud going into the tournament, but he played fantastic in this game on a Maokai pick that can really take over the map. He was able to generate a lot of those early leads. He very much kept the Caitlyn from being that much of a problem, and in the mid to late game, he was doing a lot to make sure that both the Misfortune and the Aatrox were really, really online. So you got to give a lot of credit to Croc there as well. And then Robo is the other player that I really, really, really want to talk about. I put a tweet out today. Obligatory plug, if you're not following me on Twitter, I highly recommend it. I'm a little bit more unhinged on Twitter. My thoughts on here are a little bit more unbiased and composed. If you want to see some more raw reactions, I recommend you go follow me on Twitter. That's going to be down in the description. But I tweeted out today that, like, Robo has very quietly been one of the best top laners at the tournament, and it really hasn't been close, and I believe that. Like, Robo has been fantastic. He's consistently been able to generate leads against some of the better players in the world. He absolutely bodied Impact, even in the game that EG won. You have to remember, EG won every single lane except for top lane, where Impact was super far behind. Yes, he was able to make some moves in the late game, but Robo did a great job of being able to power through him in the laning phase. And then he does the same thing to Wunder here, the two strongest top laners in the group. Robo beats both of them in the 1v1, and this is a counter pick for Wunder. The Fiora into Aatrox is pretty Fiora favored as long as you're good at Fiora, and to see Wunder lose it so hard was definitely very, very impressive on the side of Robo. If he keeps this up, Loud is certainly going to exceed expectations. Him and Brance have certainly been the two players on this team that have blown me away the most. Brance, by the way, I don't think I said it, was my player of the game here. No surprise there. I think you realistically could give this to both Croc and Robo, depending on what you're looking for, but come on. This was Brance's game, not only on the Rift, but off the Rift. He was the guy. Seos, you gotta give credit for it too on the Amumu. Some fantastic engages. That ultimate can be a gigantic problem if you are not ready to deal with it, and he wielded it well. And then for Tinones, he was there. He was fine. Certainly not bad, but it's kind of funny all these years later to see a member of Kaboom take down another European giant trying to make it out of a group stage. It's just funny how life comes full circle like that. He was fine in this game. Certainly not great. Certainly not bad. Didn't make any mistakes. And that's kind of what he needed to do this game. Just let Robo and Brance be the heavy damage threats. Croc can control the entire map, and you just need to make sure that you're there to assist them. And overall, great game from Loud. Really not a lot of complaints. For Fnatic, definitely some things to worry about. I think the 3 players that have been playing well, or, kind of stepped up here today, mostly it was the 2 players that have really been playing well in Humanoid and Upset, that I do think had relatively okay games. Humanoid not really on the scoreline, but he didn't lose lane at all against Tinones. He was actually ahead towards the mid part of the game. It was just transitioning into that late game where Akali couldn't really do much into a super bulky team of Aatrox, Maokai, Sylas, and Amumu. Not really a lot of good assassination targets if you're not ahead there. And then I thought Upset was fine. I mean, you draft the Caitlyn, there's only so much bad you could do. He was ahead in the early game, and then he fell off. That's what happens with Caitlyn, and so overall, whatever. I thought Wonder was pretty good throughout this tournament, was not good in this game, got completely outplayed by Robo in a counter-pick matchup. Certainly something you don't want to see, but the 2 big negative players for this team throughout their tournament so far, in my opinion, have been Razork and Hylissang. You absolutely need to see more from these 2. Obviously, Razork was such a huge piece of this Fnatic team's playoff run that if he's not up to standard, I really don't think this Fnatic team is nearly as good as a lot of people can think they can be. He is so important to this team that if he goes 1-6-1 and completely gets counter-jungled and run off the map like he did in this game against Loud, I don't know if Fnatic is going to be able to consistently beat a lot of teams. Now, this Razork isn't super common. It does happen, but it's not like he's not like this every single game. But the inconsistency of Razork is something that could potentially bite Fnatic in the butt in situations where it might matter a lot more. I'm talking even just a game like EG for the tiebreaker here, or theoretically, if they do make it out of group state, out of play-ins here, that could be something that really causes them a lot of problems against some of those better teams in Group A if they do make it out of this group. And so Razork's my dud of the game here for this game number 1. Certainly something to keep in mind. And then there's Hylissang on the Braum. Not a good game from him. Again, got completely outplayed by Branson Seos throughout most of this laning phase, and then towards the back half of the game, as Braum, he was just simply playing too aggressive. I know it's Hylissang, it's what he does, but he was playing too aggressive for the map state that Fnatic was in. Really not a lot of opportunities for him to be able to make those plays, and yet he continuously tried to go for them. Those 2 players simply have to be better if Fnatic is going to get out of this group as the number 1 seed. They have to win out from this point onward. They've only got 1 more game tomorrow, as everybody does, but if they don't win it tomorrow, then it's absolutely doomed for this Fnatic team. But obviously, they still have a ton of talent here. I'm not really concerned about the consistency of players like Humanoid and Upset. They have been very good throughout the tournament, especially Humanoid, and I really don't worry about their ability to step up when it matters most. It's just about the other pieces, kind of similar to what I was talking about with RNG as a whole against DRX. You have to have everybody on this stage being able to step up. You can't have weak links, and right now it very much feels like Fnatic has some, so you really hope that they can figure it out. But for Loud, what an amazing win. You have to be super happy about this. This really does give them a genuine chance to be able to finish this group in 3rd place, which would be phenomenal. If they can win a best of 5, that would be way more than I expected this team to do in this group. I had them predicted last in this group, the 2nd worst team at Worlds going into this tournament. They have clearly outproduced that. I was very wrong about that analysis. I knew Branson Seos were going to do well. I did not nearly expect this kind of breakout from Robo, and Croc was really good in this game. If those 2 can start, can consistently play like this, and you still have that lightning rod in the bot lane with Branson Seos, Loud could be a pretty dangerous team to face off against, even for some of the better teams in this tournament. Moving on to game number 2 here, we had another really interesting one. This was one of the matchups I was most interested in going into the day. Maybe the matchup I was the most interested in going into the day. We had the 2-1 Mad Lions taking on the 2-1 Saigon Buffalo, and Mad Lions are able to pick up a very crucial win here. Obviously, 2 teams that are probably kind of looking at each other as maybe we're going to be facing each other in some best of 5s as we get into this tournament for 3 and 4, but Mad Lions doing a really good job to be able to prove that maybe they are truly a step above Saigon, who has kind of been a little up and down in terms of the aggression and in terms of the consistency over the course of this tournament. I still do like them a lot, and I think that their aggressive and kind of crazy pick-oriented nature can still be really good, and their AD carry is phenomenal, and so they always have a chance in games like this. It's just unfortunate when you draft a comp that doesn't really have a lot of options going into Mad Lions comp. So let's talk about Mad's comp, because talk about a meta-breaking comp. I'm surprised more teams aren't going in this direction when it comes to drafting right now. If low damage, high utility comps are going to be kind of on the rise, which it definitely feels like they are right now, what with the Misfortune, what with the Maokai, what with the Aatrox kind of popping into meta, none of these are like super hyper carries, right? I know we do have picks like Aphelios in meta right now, and I do think they're very good, but they're not like the number 1 AD carry or anything. You're not going to be able to expect teams to pick that regularly. If you see something that you can draft a comp like this into, pull the trigger, go for that. Because this was basically unstoppable for Saigon Buffalo. Once Mad Lions got online, there really wasn't a lot they could do. Even though the early game was a little bit up and down, I would say, overall for Mad Lions. Certainly moments where Saigon looked like they were trying to create advantages, some positioning mistakes overall for Mad Lions. Amumu, Taki was able to punish a lot of them and was able to pick up quite a few kills on himself throughout the beginning of this game. Mad Lions was always going to scale. You are Hecarim, Swain, Seraphine. You are always going to scale into the late game, and that's simply what happened for Mad, is they got to the point in these team fights where they were healing so much. The Hecarim was healing so much. The Swain was healing so much. Seraphine compounding all of that, even with the ultimate attack speed debuff too. There was so little that Saigon Buffalo could do because they just simply didn't have the damage to break through a lot of what Mad Lions was doing, that these team fights were very much going in favor of Mad, and there wasn't a lot that Saigon could do about it. It's hard to really blame them, but also this was a pretty big draft gap, in my opinion. Not so much on the bad Saigon side, but on the great draft from Mad Lions side. I really want to see more of this throughout the tournament from this team, because they really showed that they could be proactive on it. And if you're going to be proactive on a comp like this, I mean, there's just not a lot of tools that you're giving the enemy team to do anything. You gotta start here. Obviously, Hecarim, Swain, Seraphine was the core, but Seraphine, most of that has to be start with here. I mean, what a phenomenal game from Unforgiven. He's actually been quietly pretty good at this tournament. Obviously, he had a little bit of a rough start, what with the first game they had in this tournament, but pretty much every win that they've had in this tournament, Unforgiven has looked phenomenal. Obviously, it's hard to criticize him for losing against Gala, especially when everything around him basically disintegrated, but another great game here on the Seraphine. We know he can play mages in the bot lane, the signature Karthus for him. We know he's familiar with this play style. He pulls out the Seraphine here. Nobody is excited for this, but to pair that up with the Swain and the Hecarim, and for him to win so hard in the mid game here, even with Taki being able to generate leads, it's never really at the expense of Unforgiven and Kaiser. A lot of times, it's at the expense of Elyoya and Niski. So that bot lane is still going to scale incredibly well into the late game, and in these team fights, Unforgiven was absolutely perfect with those ultimates, being able to cut off a ton of damage in terms of what Saigon was able to put out, and even outside of that, just the healing, the movement speed, even the damage coming out from Seraphine was all super crucial towards the back half of this game. This pick paid so much dividends for Mad Lions that it's really hard for me to say anybody other than Unforgiven was the player of the game here. But big credit to Kaiser setting up Unforgiven really, really well. Obviously not one of the drain tanks, but certainly not a champion that you can easily burst down on the Alistar. Alistar, Seraphine, not the best Seraphine lane, but certainly something you can work with. Does offer a lot of the peel that Seraphine needs in order to stay healthy in the early game, and then can be that engaged threat in the late game. Kind of similar to what Nautilus can do, but maybe not as efficiently. Still a very, very good laning phase for those two. Even if Shogun and Taki were able to get ahead, it wasn't typically at the expense of them. Then you gotta talk about Niski here in the mid lane on the Swain. A phenomenal game from him. Very proactive. Some really, really good laning skills from him. Obviously, playing Swain into melee can be very tricky for the melee. I do understand on the side of Saigon Buffalo why you might want to go a pick like Galio overall, because you're looking at Swain, you're looking at Seraphine, and you're like, I can really shut down a lot of their damage. But the problem with that thought process is that the damage is not the problem with these two. Froggy had a really difficult time playing this lane out because Niski was consistently harassing him, pushing him under tower, and then roaming with Elyoya to create plays around the map. Kind of the Niski special, but he was able to do it on a champion that typically shouldn't be able to do that in the early to mid game, but Froggy kind of gave him the perfect matchup to be able to do that. Even if Froggy was able to kind of neutralize a lot of that damage in the late game just due to Galio's natural resistances, you're not going to break through Hecarim, Swain, Seraphine with a Galio. You're just not going to do it. No matter how long you CC them, if they're just going to heal through all the damage, none of it really matters. And so that pick definitely came back to bite Saigon. But you got to credit Niski for that as well, being able to win lane so hard. Yes, he did make a few positioning mistakes, but overall, he was still very, very positive for this game. And it was a great game from him overall. And then Elyoya on this Hecarim. Certainly haven't been entirely pleased with Elyoya throughout this entire game, but at the end it was fine. Some of the engages were really good. I talk about this with Elyoya. He learns midway through the game oh yeah, I can go on the enemy carry and I can just use my ultimate. They can't actually stop that. And he did figure that out. If MF was willing to press that ult button, he was going to go in. It caused Shogun to really have to play a lot of these fights ridiculously safe because of the pressure that Hecarim offered you. And that's really big. Obviously, with Shogun in this a little bit more aggressive mindset, Mad Lions could have been in a lot more trouble, but they never really had to worry about that because Elyoya was always in a position to push that. Armut on his signature Gnar, like I said, Kaiser on the Alistar. Everybody in this game played really well, but it really was the 3 drain tanks that made this game basically unwinnable for Saigon. For the Buffaloes, though, where did things go wrong? Well, you did get an early lead, most of it coming in the bottom lane with Shogun and Taki. Like I said, unfortunately, Amumu getting a lot of that gold is about as bad as that gets. Not really a champion I would rather have the gold on less than Amumu. There's everybody on this team does really well with gold, maybe except for that pick. So it was definitely really unfortunate to have a lot of the gold go on him early, and then eventually, like I said, you just hit this break point where there's absolutely nothing you can do. Taki very much misplayed a lot towards the back half of this game here on the Amumu. Some of those engages were just not good. I remember a specific engage where he ults just the Hecarim, and everybody else is doing a bajillion damage, and Amumu just dies, immediately after, and that's after he misses bandage toss and everything. He wasn't hitting skill shots. This was just not a very good game overall for Taki, so he's going to get my dud of the game here. Not to mention that one final fight where all you kind of have to do as Saigon is kind of wait out the Swain ultimate. If you can wait out the Swain ultimate, then you're probably in a much better position to actually 5v5 team fight. But Taki full engages while the Swain ultimate is still up. Basically cost Saigon the game. I'm not going to say it was entirely his fault. I don't know who's making those calls, but was not a good decision at all, so I have to blame him at least a little bit. And then BeanJ and Froggy both lost hard. Again, I've been very disappointed with BeanJ and Froggy over the course of this tournament. They've definitely been the weak spot of Saigon Buffalo overall. They really need to start stepping up if this team does want to compete on the level of Mad Lions, if they want to try and face them in a best of 5. Those two players are definitely going to have to matter. Very low damage coming out from that mid-jungle duo. That can be fine if you have a hyper carry in the bot lane. But with Misfortune, Camille in there, it's just very low value to have 2 champions that really don't do a lot in terms of damage unless you build them heavily into that, and then you're taking away from a lot of their strengths. They did not play well. Like I said, Froggy got completely outplayed in the early game in the mid lane. And then BeanJ, I mean, you can't even say that he had a good game overall. Not a good one on Maokai either. Has been in the top lane, tried his best to make some plays on Camille, but he's going into Gnar. Not a lot of actual damage he can do in lane because Gnar can just play ridiculously safe, and then by the time the late game hit, who is he actually jumping on and killing? He mostly used his ultimate for the invulnerability in the first frames, and so overall, not a good game from Saigon Buffalo, but there is an opportunity for them to step up. Obviously, the schedule does not get easier for them. All their easy games are done. They're sitting at 2-2 now. No spoiler alerts, obviously, for anything else that happens the rest of the day here, but depending on the outcomes of the rest of the day, if both of the other teams in this group end up not being able to pick up a win, they could very much clinch their spot in the best of 5 here and not even have to win a game against, I believe they're facing RNG tomorrow, which of course would be huge. Not having to beat RNG is probably a good thing for the Saigon Buffalo team, but again, definitely some quirks to work out. That jungle mid definitely needs to step up and start supporting Shogun, who really has been carrying this team. And then for Mad Lions, this was a really good win. It feels like they've kind of found a niche in draft that they can exploit at least a little bit consistently. Obviously, I'm sure teams are going to be aware of this now and try to take it away whenever possible. Nobody really wants to play into Swain Seraphine, and so I don't imagine they're going to get it again. But at the end of the day, Mad Lions is still a talented team, and I expect them to be able to pull stuff out to be able to make it work. Mac's a good coach. I imagine they'll figure something out if this ends up getting banned. But I do like the ingenuity, and overall, they played to their win condition essentially perfectly in this game, and that's always going to be a good sign from a team trying to make it out. Jumping into game number 3 now, we have definitely an interesting one for standings. Both of these teams really trying to find a way to break themselves into the top 4 in Group A right now. We have the 1-1 Beyond Gaming taking on the 1-2 Detonation FocusMe. Now, obviously, both of these teams having won some very important games and having lost some important games. DFM crucially not being able to pick up a win against Loud, while on the flip side, Beyond is able to pick up a win against Loud, but contrary to that, DFM is able to pick up a pretty giant win here against Beyond in order to set themselves up at 2-2 and actually in a decent spot to control their own destiny for moving into that best of 5. This is the exact kind of situation that DFM needed to put themselves into. This was a really, really good game, and they really threw a lot at the wall. They went back to a lot more comfort. They knew things were on the line, and they decided to go with the draft that I think they were excited to play. You go for the Kai'Sa as your quote-unquote hyper carry in the bottom lane. Totally okay with that, even if I don't think she's as good as Aphelios in the meta right now. I totally understand if you want to feel like you have more proactivity with Kai'Sa, especially if you want to pair it with something like an Amumu. I understand that idea a lot. You go for the Trundle, trying to kind of negate a lot of the effects that the Maokai offers, and honestly, love that. I was talking about this in my meta preview. I thought Trundle was going to be the #1 jungler at Worlds this year, mostly just because I thought he had such a phenomenal matchup into a lot of the really bulky tanks that were going to be very common at the World Championships, and I expect to see his priority continue to rise as Maokai becomes arguably the most important jungler in the game. And then they go to two more unique picks that are more comfort for them. Obviously, Yaharong, a big Vex player, talked about this a little bit in their preview, but they pull out the Vex here, and they go to the Lilia top lane as kind of another tank crusher. Definitely an idea to go into Gnar and Maokai, and even the Leona to an extent. Lilia does such a phenomenal job into melees in general. She really has a ton of tools to keep people who can't reach her at bay. Obviously, the movement champion is going to have a lot of trouble with people who can't get on top of her very easily, and so the Gnar matchup, the Maokai matchup, Sylas even, Leona, like, these picks don't really have an easy way to be able to get on and deal with the Lilia, and she does a really good job in laning phase being able to take advantage of that, and this is where I'm finally starting to see Evie break back out of his shell. I've been very critical of Evie's first 2 days in the tournament so far because I really just don't think he's played all that well, and he's incredibly integral to what this DFM team actually wants to do, and if they get to the best of 5s, he's really going to need to step up. And this was a good game from him. It wasn't perfect. The casters weren't really super in love with a lot of his play. I certainly didn't agree with that. For me, he was the player of the game. He was the most important player here. He was creating a lot of opportunities for the rest of the team to be able to push forward with him because he could play so aggressive and was never really able to be punished for it. Kino spent almost the entire game trying to get on this Lilia and had absolutely no success on it. So Evie, for me, was the most important player of the game, even if he didn't do the most damage, even if he didn't, tank the most damage or whatever, right? His laning stats were phenomenal. He absolutely destroyed Lakai in lane. I mean, to be expected, it's very difficult to play as Gnar into Lilia just in general, but even outside of that, he was a complete nuisance to have to go into and really gave DFM a lot of avenues to engage and be proactive towards the back half of this game. So for me, Evie is going to get the player of the game on this Lilia, but you got to give a lot of credit to Yutapon here. If you're talking about damage threats, that's what Yutapon was in this game on the Kai'Sa. Like I said, I'm actually very partial to hyper carries in this meta. I do like Misfortune as a pick, but I think things like the Caitlyn, or, maybe even the Kalista to an extent, are potentially being overvalued. I think Kalista is still really good, but, like, maybe a little, I don't know if Kalista is, like, obscenely the #1 AD carry without a doubt, right? I think that picks like Aphelios, picks like Kai'Sa definitely hold a good place in the meta because if you do get these games that go 40 minutes, both of them are going to be incredibly useful, and Yutapon was able to prove that. Those ultimates in this game, he was able to go in, do a ton of damage, and basically eliminate certain threats from fights as soon as it started. Aphelios had to play so safe towards the back half of this game because he could not risk getting tagged by the Kai'Sa because she would blow him up instantly. Even Sylas was in a similar predicament. Someone who is very known for being able to take on these hyper carry AD carries in the late game if he can get on top of them. Sylas had absolutely no business trying to fight Kai'Sa in this game. You got to give a lot of credit to Yutapon and Harp for that same matter for being able to so consistently be able to generate that lead in the bot lane and get the Kai'Sa in a position where she can win the game basically on her own in terms of damage. Steel and Yaharong were also really good this game. Certainly not two people that I want to overshadow. Steel did a really good job playing Trundle. I talk about this a lot. You need to be able to generate early leads. Even though Husha was in a decent spot, honestly, Steel didn't, dominate the early game or anything like that. Just having the Trundle in general to be able to ult Maokai towards the back half of these fights in the game were phenomenal and really opened up a lot of opportunities for DFM and especially for Yaharong, because if you're going to go in on Vex and you're going to ult in and, try to blow people up, it's going to be really difficult if the comp is Gnar, Maokai, Sylas, Leona. There's not a lot of good targets to go in on there, and so you're really relying on the Trundle to be able to steal a lot of that. You're relying on the Lilia to be able to pull people off of the team fight in order to create kind of this split fight scenario, and she can stay safe during a lot of it. And then Kai'Sa's secondary damage was absolutely huge for this team overall. Just a great game from DFM. Not a lot to complain about. As for Beyond, not a bad game overall. They certainly were in this, at least in terms of fighting. They were able to keep up in a lot of the team fights. They very much did get out macroed in a lot of this game. Like I said, the Lilia was causing them all kinds of problems in terms of they invested a lot into trying to kill her in a lot of these fights, and it just was something that was never going to work out. A lot of bad decisions in my mind, and a lot of that is going to rest on Kino, in my opinion, someone who was going to be incredibly crucial to this comp on the Leona. He is there engaged, like, basically all in one. Like, Maokai can do it, kind of, but Leona really is the one that needs to get on the targets and lock them down, and unfortunately, a lot of the times he was trying to go in, he was going in on either the Lilia or on the Trundle. There just wasn't a lot of opportunities for him to get on the people who actually mattered in this game, because you're never going to actually get on Lilia as Leona. You're just not. And then the Trundle, like, who cares if you get on Trundle? He's going to steal Maokai's stats, or hell, he's even going to steal your stats. He's just going to stand there, he's going to pillar, he's going to cause a nuisance, and Kais is going to get a ton of time to break people up. That's assuming a Mumu doesn't ult as well to just stop you in your tracks. And so definitely want to see more out of the Beyond support. This bot lane was definitely the weakness for this team in the PCS throughout the regular season. I talked about that in my preview, and they're, in my opinion, continuing to be a little bit of a weakness for this Beyond Gaming team. They're definitely going to have to step it up. Husha and Minji have definitely been the two main pieces of this team, not only in the PCS, but again here on Worlds, and they did step up. I thought both of them played relatively well. Husha had a good early game, and Minji was definitely able to make a lot of plays, but they were just getting out proactive, like I said, by DFM. A lot of those plays that Lilia, Trundle, Vex were making weren't able to be matched by the Maokai and the Sylas, and that's certainly not a champion problem. Again, you just have to simply be better as players. The big problem I've been having with Beyond Gaming right now is that going into this tournament, I felt like Minji was a really good player that might potentially show up and cause a lot of problems for teams, but we're here basically on the third day at this point, and there is not really a player that has stood out to me. Nobody on this team has really been phenomenal. Minji has clearly been their best player, but it's not been to the point where I'm like, oh, like Minji is like really carrying this team to a lot of their wins. It's just like, if they win, they win. If they lose, they lose. And that's never a good sign for a team at Worlds. Lakai never had a shot on Gnar in the top lane. What are you going to do in Lilia? Overall, not a great game from Beyond, but definitely look to see more from this team. They still potentially have a shot to be making it in to the best of fives, but they are going to have to potentially win a really, really rough game against Fnatic tomorrow, depending on how things go, in order to get to that spot, which would definitely not be ideal. For DFM, though, great win. You set yourself up to control your own destiny. Not the best game of all time tomorrow against Evil Geniuses. You certainly want to be in a spot where you don't have to win that game, but depending on what happens with Loud and with Beyond, you might honestly be in a position where you can lose that and still make it. And so this win, I think, is going to end up being incredibly consequential for this team. You're really happy to see Evie step up. Yaharong and Yutapon have been great. If this team can continue firing, I'm not going to say that they'll be favorites in whatever best of five they play against whatever team, but they're certainly not a team you can take lightly no matter who you're playing against. Jumping into game number 4 here, we have another interesting matchup between two teams that I thought were going to be a lot closer in terms of skill level, but one certainly hasn't performed to the way I expected at this tournament. We have the 2-1 Evil Geniuses taking on the 0-2 Chiefs Esports, and EG is able to pick up a really clean win here. This is EG's best win of the tournament, in my opinion, so far, and unfortunately, it is against the Chiefs. Obviously, we can sit here and we can talk about how the Chiefs have not really been able to hold up to a lot of the expectations that I had for them going into this tournament, and how, honestly, a lot of these players really just aren't holding up on an individual level, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Let's talk about what Evil Geniuses did well, first and foremost, and first of all, gotta say it, it's on the day of, so I gotta say it, happy birthday, JoJo. He turns 18 today, and he's been stomping noobs for 7 months already, so big shout out to JoJo. Hope he parties tonight. Not too hard, because we need him for tomorrow, but hope he has a good birthday, and he certainly made it count today in his birthday game against Os and against Tally, who certainly has been a little bit, no offense to Tally, no flame intended, but a little bit of a pushover so far, at least in laning phase, throughout most of the games that they have played. JoJo continues that trend here. They take the Azir Victor trade in the mid lane. Really like that for Evil Geniuses. It gives JoJo a lot of proactivity to be able to be a hyper carry towards the back half of this game. And it also gives your comp a lot more flexibility for you to play a lot safer in the bot lane. You draft the Ezreal here to go into the Aphelios, really trying to stop him from being able to generate the lead that he's going to need in order to take over the game in the late phase. And then you draft the Hecarim, you draft the Gangplank, you give your players opportunity, even the Leona for Vulcan, I should say. You give your other players there's opportunities for them to go out and make plays and outplay their opponents, and that's kind of just what they did. For me, I think player of the game was a little bit difficult here. I almost gave it to JoJo. He was doing a ridiculous amount of damage in that lane. Obviously, first strike Victor, not ideal. He was playing ridiculously aggressive in the mid game. It sometimes cost him, but for the most part, he was really, really solid when it came to all of that. But at the end of the day, it was really hard for me not to give player of the game in this one to Inspired on the Hecarim. A really magnificent performance. He was going into Lee Sin as a Hecarim, and honestly, matchup-wise, I can see a world in which Arthur is able to dictate a lot of the pace of the early game, especially if he's able to influence one of these lanes. You know, I'm not sure which one it would be ideally. Gangplank can play really safe in the early game. The Azir is just better than the Victor, or in this case, JoJo's just better than Tally, and it's not like you're really going to be consistently getting on the Ezreal, and so definitely a little bit tricky to see where Lee Sin's going to be able to generate that lead, but Lee Sin should just generally have more pressure when it comes to fighting for Crab, setting up for objectives, things like that, but Inspired just outplayed Arthur. It really wasn't all that difficult to do, and Inspired was really able to take over the map on the Hecarim, was able to create a lot of opportunities for this Evil Geniuses team to break the gold lead open, and I think they did that. JoJo was really out on the map, trying to make plays, moving around, taking 2v2, 3v3 skirmishes that EG felt very confident that they could win because they knew they were better, and a lot of that was just because of Inspired. Then you get to the late game, you've got Kaori firing away on these Ezreal Qs, you've got Impact doing a ton of damage with barrel crits and everything. If Inspired jumps on the backline, it's really difficult for Raze to actually do anything in this game, and so Inspired really played it about as perfectly as you could, and for me, he was a pretty easy choice for player of the game, but like I said, that does not diminish the effect of what a player like JoJo Pyun did in this game, where he was crazy aggressive, played crazy fast, and it very much worked out for him. This is the ideal version of Evil Geniuses. This is the kind of team that they were in the regular season, where they were really bodying a lot of the worst teams in the LCS. It's because Inspired and JoJo would play with that no fear, brain off kind of mentality, but they would do it in a way where they were able to generate consistent leads and just snowball the game out of control from there. Obviously, no Danny means the playstyle has to be at least a little bit different going into these games now, but I still think Evil Geniuses has a plan in mind, and they're able to execute on it really, really well. You have Impact there if you need that secondary damage dealer towards the back half of the game. Yes, the Vladimir is a pretty good counterpick into Gangplank in kind of the isolated matchup in the top lane, but it's still Impact on Gangplank. He's going to be useful in the late game, and there's really not a lot the Chiefs are going to be able to do to stop that. And then the Ezreal is still going to do damage, and Kaori has been good at Worlds. There's really nothing else to say. He's been fine at Worlds. He's certainly not been the problem or a problem for Evil Geniuses. Put Vulcan on something that he can be a little bit more proactive on. Really liked his play on the Thresh yesterday. He has another good one on the Leona here today. Overall, just a good game from Evil Geniuses. As for Chiefs, the ideas in draft, I do understand, at least on principle, but I don't really get them in the context of facing Evil Geniuses. You want to go for that early game lead, so you draft the Lee Sin, you leave counterpick for Tapoon in the top lane to try and get that counterpick on Impact overall, and I get those ideas, but you opt into the Aphelios, and I'm the biggest Aphelios fan in the world right now. I think he's incredibly strong and can very consistently carry games in the late if you can get there relatively even, but the Aphelios isn't really going to have a lot of opportunities to generate a lead here unless the Lee Sin's in his lane all the time. And if Lee Sin's in his lane all the time, who's he going to hit? The Leona, ideally, but it's really easy for Leona to get out of situations like that. And then you opt into the kind of the control mage trade here with the Azir versus Victor, which you're really just relying on Tally to step up and be a huge damage part in the mid game, and he's just never going to be that. Unfortunately for Chiefs, they have to recognize that Tally just isn't the best player on their team, and they kind of needed him to be with this comp. And so overall, was a little disappointed in the comp selection. Maybe that's just results-based analytics. I really try to draw a fine line there where I try not to just say, oh, this was a bad comp because they lost. I can see the idea of where this works, and I think a better team would be able to pull this off significantly more efficiently and more successfully, but unfortunately for Chiefs, they went into this as pretty big underdogs, and they didn't draft like it. For them, though, my dud of the game is going to go to Aladoric on the Nautilus. It's just really frustrating watching a Nautilus continue to go in without really a lot of backup. I understand wanting to play aggressive, but it's not like the Aphelios is going to be able to burst people down if the Nautilus can go in. Tally got super far behind on the Victor, so you don't really have that form of damage. Where else is the damage going to come from in a lot of these team fights? I don't really have an answer for that. Now Aladoric kept going in, kept trying to make plays. I get the idea of it, but a lot of them were really not good plays to be made, and overall, it really felt like the Nautilus pick wasn't all that useful, so unfortunately, he gets my dud of the game. I really don't mean to keep giving dud of the game to engaged supports. I know I'm not trying to equate, like, high death numbers with dud of the game. Anybody who's followed the channel for any extended period of time will know that I typically don't do this. I just really didn't like the quality of engages that Aladoric was going for, and I feel like I've thoroughly ragged on Tally throughout the group stage play-ins so far, and so it felt more appropriate, I think, to give it to Aladoric in this one, but not a good game from the Chiefs really at all, and definitely a lot of things they need to change. They have one more game later today, and if they're not able to win that, they are out of contention for even making the best of fives, and so their tournament life is on the line right now. This is a team that is very much underperformed at this tournament. We saw Order really underperform at MSI, Chiefs kind of following in that suit. You're hoping that they're able to turn it around because, at least for me, I really like a lot of the players on this team. Players like Raze and Aladoric I've been vouching for over the course of the year. I think a player like Arthur has been incredibly underrated in the grand scheme of things, but it just seems like they're not going to be on that same level when it comes to international play. As for Evil Geniuses, great win. With Fnatic's loss earlier, your entire tournament structure has now shifted around. If you win out as Evil Geniuses, you're now in a position to play Fnatic in a tiebreaker to get out of this group at number 1. And like I talked about with Group A, getting out of this group as the number 1 seed is incredibly important because you don't want to have to be in a situation where you have to potentially play a team like Mad Lions in a best of 5 for your life at Worlds. Evil Geniuses would much rather be in a spot where they can just win one game, get out of playing groups, and then, get slotted into the group of death. But, that aside, I really think they're going to be happy with this win as long as they can clean things up towards the back half of this group stage. They're at least going to have an opportunity to play for their World's lives here. Moving into game number 5 here, we definitely have an interesting one that I was really excited to talk about the moment Champion Select ended. If you watch the day, you know exactly where I'm going with this, but it's time to talk about the 1-1 Royal Never Give Up taking on the 0-2 Isurus Gaming. And RNG does pick up the win, and I should say no. If you are looking at your screen right now, it is not bugged. I did not mess up the graphic. This is exactly what happened in Champion Select. You were looking at an Isurus Gaming team that drafted Teemo top, Lilia in the jungle, which isn't that weird in the grand scheme of things, but kind of weird, and then Saigon mid. Certainly some decisions from Isurus, which we will certainly get to. Obviously, context for this definitely matters. ADD played a Champions Queue game, I believe yesterday on Teemo in the top lane. Absolutely obliterated Vital, who is Immortals Academy's top laner. On the Aatrox, he must have felt like this was a really brokenly good matchup that he could really take advantage of, and he plays it here. ADD pulls it out on the world stage, only the second time in history that Teemo's been played on the world stage. Obviously, Reginald's famous game before this, but ADD pulls it out here. You complement that with the Scion mid, which, to this moment, it's been hours. I still don't know what this does. I still don't know why you pick it, but shout out Scion mid. Maybe you felt you needed some tankiness, you needed some frontline abilities, so you were just like, I guess we'll put a mid lane. It was certainly something. I'll get to them later. Let's talk about RNG. Shout out RNG and shout out Breathe. He gets his first game at Worlds in his career, and he's got to play into Teemo. What an absolute disaster for him, but he absolutely crushes that lane. He does die early to a really good gank from Grell, who does spend a good amount of early resources investing into that Teemo lane, trying to get it ahead, trying to make sure that it can hit that point in the game where it can just outrange and really annoy everybody else on the enemy team. But unfortunately, from that point onwards, it really only went down for Teemo, and it went up for Breathe on that Aatrox, where he was really able to 1v1 Teemo consistently, basically from 6 or 7 minutes onward in the game, and Teemo had to play so passively. He dominated and completely took over that lane, was really able to help way out a lot in a lot of the top lane skirmishes, really was just a huge damage threat towards the middle part. Wanted to talk about him first because it's his first World Championship, and I think that's great. But the player of the game for me, I know this is going to be a little controversial because a lot of people are going to want to give this to Ming, but my player of the game is going to be Wei on the Graves here. I actually thought he was really consistent in this game, and his jungle pathing has only gotten better over the course of the year. Wei was actually someone who I was a little bit concerned about moving into this tournament, not in like a micro sense, not in like a play-in sense, but in a grand scheme sense of I did my top 20 players at Worlds. Obviously, if you guys didn't check that out, go check it out. No, definitely not a shameless plug, but I had 4 RNG players on that list. I had Breathe, Xiaohu, Gala, and Ming all on that list. I did not have Wei. He was the one RNG player that didn't make it. He was the one that I think needed to prove the most to me going into this tournament. And honestly, he has probably been the most consistent member of RNG over the course of the beginning few games. I know I went on that big rant at the end of day 1 after they lost to DRX where I was like, Wei and Gala need to start stepping up. They didn't step up in LPL playoffs. they didn't step up in the LPL regional finals. Like, it was the time to do it. Well, clearly they watched the videos. There's no other explanation because Wei and Gala have been significantly better, yes, against much worse competition, but at least they're starting to step up. If they can play really, really efficiently, obviously jungle and bot being two incredibly important roles right now, that's going to be huge, and Wei had a great game. He was going into Grell, who probably has been Isurus Gaming's best player over the course of the tournament. Really haven't rated anybody else all that highly, but I think Grell certainly has some moments that have at least caught my attention. And Wei really did a good job being able to manage him. Grell had a decent game, tried to do as much as he could on the Lilia. Like I said, really did invest into that Teemo early game, and then he was at least trying to make plays towards the mid game to keep Isurus in this, but honestly, by like 6-7 minutes into this game, it was completely over for Isurus. There really wasn't a lot that they could do there, and so Wei did a really good job being able to corral that, being able to take a lead that a lot of the lanes were getting, and being able to expedite all of them into a path of no resistance, not least resistance, literally no resistance, and you gotta credit Wei for that, but obviously a lot of people are gonna talk about Gala and Ming in this game, and it's really hard for me to argue. Ming probably should be the player of the game just in terms of stat line and the way that the game ended up working out, where a lot of those set engages were unstoppable. He was doing so much damage with the Haymaker towards the back half of a lot of these fights. Gala was cleaning up on a lot of them really well. Obviously, Kai'Sa set a very famous lane from years ago, set certainly not in the same position that he was like last year, for instance, but still an incredibly good lane, and it's Gala on Kai'Sa. Like, what did you expect? He took over the game against what is probably the worst team at Worlds. Like, no one was particularly surprised by this outcome, but big credit to Gala, Ming, and Wei, because they played great. I talked about Breathe. He was good. Xiao, who pulls out the Syndra, a pick I really didn't expect to see a lot at Worlds this year. There were a lot of good control mages right now. I didn't think Syndra was one of them. I expected to see Victor and Ori and Azir and all that kind of stuff before I would see Syndra, but obviously Xiao, who's phenomenal on Syndra, this definitely is a comfort pick for him. And if he felt like he could style on the blind pick, whatever it ended up being, then that's great. It ended up being Saigon, and of course he was able to dominate that matchup to the surprise of quite literally absolutely no one. And so overall, just a really good game from RNG. Very, very little to criticize. For Isurus, on the other hand, a lot to criticize. First of all, this draft is completely troll. I understand the idea of you dominating in Champions Queue on the Teemo and wanting to take it to stage, but you played against Vital, not Breathe. You didn't play against RNG, and man, did Breathe absolutely dominate this lane. ADD got solo killed more times than I can even count. He's a very clear choice for dud of the game. You know, I hate to give it to the Teemo, but unfortunately he earned it. Seiya basically did nothing on the Sion. It wasn't really his fault. I mean, what is Sion truly to do into a matchup with Syndra? He just got shoved into his wave into his turret the entire game. Couldn't really roam to any of these plays, and when he got there, it's not like he was doing damage, or it's not like he was tanking things up, because the entire team was super far behind. Gavoto and Jelly have been the weak point of Isurus throughout this entire tournament anyways, and they had to play into Gala and Ming. They never stood a chance, and then even when Grell was making plays, it really never even mattered all that much, and so definitely disappointing to see from Isurus, but not all that surprising. This is, in my opinion, the best team in play-ins going against the worst team in play-ins. There's really not a lot I can say about this. Probably the biggest stomp in play-ins so far. I know it's not like the shortest game time, but in terms of actual quality of game, this is probably the biggest stomp that we've had in play-ins so far. But Isurus, for their credit, like, they're technically still in it. They're 0-3. They have another game later today. If they can't pick that game up, then they are officially eliminated from best of 5 contention. You can't start 0-4 and still make the best of 5s mathematically. It is unfortunately impossible, and so it is now win or go home for this Isurus team. I do appreciate the idea that they tried to go for here. I get the idea of wanting to play like crazy meta shakeups like Teemo, Sion mid, like things that RNG have never prepped for, because you know that you're not going to beat them on anything that they have prepped for, but this ended up making it even easier for them because the Teemo and the Sion did absolutely nothing and actively took away from Isurus' chances at winning. But for RNG, clean game, not the, you know, there's really nothing to complain about. They looked great. Nobody on this team looked bad at all. Breathe died early, but he rebounded well. Other than that, nobody else was ever really in any danger at any point in the game, and so for RNG, this is great. Obviously, at this point, if you're an RNG fan, you're really hoping for DRX to slip up against somebody, because that would at least give you a chance to get first place in this group, but outside of that, all you can do is win out and hope that you get placed in a good position to win whatever best of 5 you're placed in at the end of this group stage. Moving on to our 6th game of the day here, we had a very important one in terms of seeding matchups, if only because someone's tournament life was on the line, as we had the 0-3 Chiefs team fighting for their playoff lives here against the 1-2 Beyond Gaming. If Chiefs don't win, no shot at a best of 5. Like I said, you can't go 0-4 and still make it, and unfortunately for Chiefs, Beyond is pretty cleanly able to take this game in about 25-26 minutes. Certainly not what you wanted to see if you were an OS fan. This is the most dominant team in OS history in terms of performance. Maybe not in terms of lineup, obviously we'll get to that, but in terms of actual performance, the LCO or the OPL or any rep from OS has never performed this well domestically. And then for them to come to Worlds and so far not even be able to take a single game off of any team at the World Championships has been definitely a little disappointing. But before we get into the negatives, let's talk about the positives with Beyond. And this was a good win for Beyond. They definitely set themselves up for a pretty interesting day number 4 here, as them, DFM, Loud, all sitting at 2-2 now, and all certainly in a position to make the best of 5s depending on what happens tomorrow. Unfortunately for Beyond, obviously they have the toughest game having to face Fnatic, but definitely some good spots here. First thing to note, they sub in Liang in the top lane here for Lakai. Not entirely sure why that is. Liang, obviously, someone that people might be familiar with if you're a longtime Worlds fan. I know this name definitely caught me by surprise when he came in here. Obviously, some people are going to remember him from Beyond. Last year, he split some time with PK when this team made Worlds with Doggo, but if you're really like an old LMS fan, which I used to watch the LMS really consistently back around this time, you'll remember him from Mad Team back in like 2018. They made the World Championships. So he's certainly not inexperienced, but it certainly wasn't like Lakai was playing bad. The broadcast explained it as Lakai being much more of a tank-oriented player, where Liang is more that super aggressive, like punishing top laner. And I get that, but you put him in only to have him R1 Aatrox? Like, okay, sure. I think Lakai could have probably handled playing Aatrox, but you know, whatever you think is going to be better for you. I liked Lakai and didn't see really any of Liang because I was only able to catch playoffs for the PCS, but you know, he was fine in this game. Honestly, he was good enough. The Aatrox itself is a really strong pick, and he was able to dominate that matchup against Tapoon. It's hard for me to really complain. Obviously, the Kennen matchup is typically a counter pick to the Aatrox, but when your top laner isn't all that good, which unfortunately Tapoon just isn't, there's pretty much no way that you can actively deal with the Aatrox. His damage is significantly too high. If he's able to outposition and just outtrade you, then he's just going to win. And that was unfortunately what happened for Beyond in this game if you were a Chiefs fan. But wasn't really the main focal point of Beyond in this game. I would definitely say that main focal point was Minji in the mid lane. And that's what I was talking about with Beyond. I said it earlier in the day. I certainly talked about this at length in their preview. Minji is the guy on this team. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Waco, and Kino, however you want to say it. I'm bad with pronunciations, by the way. If you want to yell at me in the comment section for all my pronunciation errors, you can go ahead and do that. But Waco and Kino in the bot lane certainly aren't like a carry-oriented bot lane, not a side of the map that Beyond typically invests in. Husha spends a lot of time investing into that mid lane, and Minji is often given a lot of responsibility to carry this team in late game team fights. He was given the Sylas in this game. Certainly a champion that is capable of doing that. You have the matchup into Talia, one that I think we've all become very familiar with over the course of the year, and the Sylas I think typically wins this, especially in the state that he's in right now. Minji has a lot of really good ultimate targets here, and we saw that throughout the game. Some really good steals at opportune times. Obviously, the Kennen ultimate is one that I think comes to a lot of people's minds, but certainly wasn't even at the top of my list in this game. The Xin Zhao ultimate was used incredibly effectively for really aggressive dives that the Sylas wanted to go on, and then the broadcast mentioned this multiple times, and they were correct. He used Leona ult significantly better than Leona did at a lot of portions in this game, and so really good one for Minji. He was able to output his damage really effectively while also knowing the exact limits of where he could put himself in danger. This is the kind of mid laner that needs to show up for Beyond Gaming at this tournament for them to be an actual threat. Obviously, I thought they were the 5th best team in this group going into the group stage, but Chiefs has certainly fallen down that list. I think you can make a real case that they should be top 4, and Minji is a big reason for that. He is one of the better mid laners in this group, and he continues, I think, to prove that, even if the team around him isn't the most consistent. Husha gets the Maokai. Maokai's still an incredibly impressive pick. Obviously, it had a 100% win rate going into today. Some losses earlier today, but that doesn't distract from how good Maokai generally is, and I think he definitely proved that in this game. The zone control that Maokai can have really shuts down a lot of what Xin Zhao wants to do, especially in the early game. He really has to out-macro the Maokai in order for those plays to go off, because if you get into 2v2 or 3v3 situations and the Maokai is able to join there, the Xin Zhao becomes significantly less effective if he has to go through him. And so Husha doing a good job. He even built damage this game. Those saplings were doing ridiculous amounts of damage, especially towards the back half of the game. And they give you free vision. What a value pick Maokai is. And then Waco and Kino, for as much as I crap on them for really not being the power point of this team and honestly not being all that good in my opinion, they played really well in this game. The Ezreal Alistar, certainly not a lane that you have to invest in, and definitely does well into Leona. We saw that earlier in the day as well. Ezreal has a really difficult time being caught. That's kind of the point of Ezreal, and Leona doesn't really do anything other than go in. And so if you can just kind of wait the lane phase out, if your mid laner, your jungler, your top laner are generating leads, that Ezreal is still going to be efficient in the late game, and they did their job. This was probably one of the better games they've had at Worlds so far. Really haven't liked what I've seen from them, but honestly was pretty impressed with how they played this one, especially Kino on the Alistar. So overall, like what Beyond Gaming did here, poor Chiefs. They have now officially been eliminated. They are the first team at Worlds in 2022 to officially be eliminated from best of 5 contention. They cannot make the best of 5s. They cannot make the group stage now. There is no world in which that can happen, and it's just really unfortunate. Like I said, the most dominant team in OS history, for them to come out and not even be able to pick up a win at really any point over the course of the first 4 games. They kind of got outplayed by everyone. They at least gave Fnatic a little bit of the run for their money, but outside of that, they weren't even really all that close in a lot of their games, and that's definitely disappointing to see. Players like Raze, Arthur, I do think have potential. They didn't really show up at this tournament. Arthur, I really wanted to see more out of. He went to the very early game aggressive stuff today. We saw the Lee Sin and the Xin Zhao. Certainly things that want to make an impact in the early game, but he wasn't really able to do that. Alidoric was someone who I was definitely singing the praises of going into this tournament. He had a very bad day. Definitely not a good Nautilus game earlier. Maybe an even worse Leona game here. He could not hit an ultimate in those late game team fights to save his life. And then you don't need me to tell you how anti-proactive these solo laners have been for a significant amount of this tournament. Tapoon gets run over by Liang here in a counter matchup that he has. Tally, just generally, I think you can make a real case. He's been the worst player at play-ins so far. Just disappointing overall for Chiefs. It's disappointing for the region, and it's not really their fault. Obviously, everything going on with the LCO and the little that is invested into that league and the amount of players that, if you have any sort of talent, immediately get snatched up by North America. It's just made OSA a very difficult region to actually perform on the main stage. We hoped that a team like Chiefs would be able to do it, but unfortunately, it just doesn't seem like it's possible. Ideally, and this is sad for me to say, I know I shouldn't say this, but if the league's not going to get invested in, it is what it is. Players like Raze, players like Alidoric, Arthur is eligible for OS residency. If he can get that, these are players that I think ideally are going to be looked at by North American teams for Academy next year. And that's good. I think players like that definitely deserve a chance to play in a potentially a better league. But it's just rough to see them on the world stage and for them not really to be able to perform at all. Obviously, players like Tapoon, Tally, Raze have had their time in North America. I'm not forgetting that. But Raze is a good player, and he definitely didn't deserve whatever happened on Immortals last year. And so hopefully, some of these players can get a second shot in a region that might actually treat them well, unlike the LCO. And so shout out Chiefs. They made Worlds, and I'm happy for the run they had over the course of the year, but this is kind of where the story comes to an end. They have one more game tomorrow, basically just for pride, but unfortunately, they can no longer make it out of groups, and that means their tournament is essentially over. For Beyond, though, like I said, they put themselves in a pretty decent position here. If they win tomorrow, that's absolutely ginormous for their chances. Basically, any of the teams sitting at 2-2, if they win tomorrow, they're probably in the best of 5s, unless all of them win, which is incredibly improbable. But if one of them win, like if you're Beyond and you're able to somehow manage to take down Fnatic, you're going to be in the best of 5s, and from there on out, like, anything can happen. It's a tough road ahead, but it's going to be a tough road no matter what. You just have to play for your win con now, and Beyond winning this game certainly set themselves up to do that throughout the rest of this tournament. Moving on to the 7th game of the day here, we had another interesting one, a major region team taking on a minor region team with the minor region team's life on the line. A bit of more of a challenge to overcome than potentially Beyond Gaming was. But in this one, we had the 2-1 Royal Never Give Up playing the 0-3 Istanbul Wildcats, and RNG is able to take it. I mean, it would have taken a monumental effort for Istanbul to be able to knock off RNG. Obviously, this is potentially one of the top 7 teams in the world. For you to even be here and be able to face them is a pretty good accomplishment, but unfortunately, your tournament life ends here as RNG seals your fate. RNG is just so freaking good. Like, it's really difficult to talk about games like this because, and this is similar to the RNG game from before, obviously a little less so. I do think that there is a little bit of room to talk about, like, ideas that Istanbul had and how RNG was able to get around them. But at the end of the day, like, in the same way to what they did with Isurus, they simply are just so much better. Like, it's not just that, oh, they're better, so they won. They're simply so much better that it doesn't really matter what they do. They're always in the lead. Like, they have such a commanding presence on the map, and their macro's so good, and, like, there's really just not a lot that Istanbul can actually do in order to play the game here, and a lot of that is on RNG. Like, I'm not blaming Istanbul for that. A lot of that is RNG being really, really good. Wei got player of the game in game number 1. Zhao, who's going to get it in game number 2 for me here on the Silas. Been talking about this pick all day. When it's played right, it is basically unstoppable for pretty much anybody that wants to go into it. That is including the likes of Akali, who I have sang the praises of on this channel as a pick that I want to see rise in production here at Worlds and proactivity, but like, Akali doesn't really have a lot of good answers to Silas if he gets ahead, and that's what happened here. Zhao, who got a ton of gold in the early game, really good early game from Wei to be able to set things up. Obviously, Istanbul goes for a little bit of a different draft. This is definitely more acceptable than whatever Isurus did in that game with the Teemo and the Saigon. The Garen top, certainly something that I think theoretically could be okay. Into the likes of Aatrox could be a lane threat at a time. It didn't end up working out, but does do damage in the late game. Like, honestly, Garen's just not a pick that I really like all that much. I'm not really sure what the pick does for the most part. But you have that. You pair that up with the Samira in the bot lane, even with the Maokai, the Akali. You really want to dive in on the backline members of this team. The problem is the only backline member of RNG is Tristana. And it's not like you're going to dive onto a Tristana. And so, a good idea from the Wildcats. Unfortunately, they got so hard countered in draft when RNG realized, like, if we just draft a bunch of really aggressive things that want to fight you, like, face-to-face, Garen, Samira, Akali, Set, like, none of these picks are actually going to be all that useful. And that's essentially what happened in this game. Zhao, who got super far ahead and really was able to 1v1 the Akali, was able to 1v1 the Garen, was able to absolutely obliterate the Samira, who had 0 impact on the game. Don't want to take away credit from Istanbul, but Zhao, who I thought played it well. Wei controlled a lot of the early game. Breathe demolished Starscreen in lane. He was up by a ton in a pick that I assume you would consider a counter matchup because they picked it as a counter, and so I imagine it has to count as such, but Garen certainly didn't win that lane. A lot of credit to Breathe. I tweeted this out today. Poor Breathe finally gets a 2-game day at Worlds, his first time at Worlds, and he has to play against Teemo and Garen. Absolutely sad for him, but hopefully he'll get some matchups that he can actually try in over the next couple of days. These just seem kind of free low for him. And then you have Gala picking up the Tristana, a very, very good call from this RNG team. As soon as they recognized, they saw the Samira first pick, they saw the Akali come around, you're just like, okay, well, sure. Like, Tristana seems like a good thing in order to prevent a lot of this diving into the backline that they clearly want to do. And it certainly did work out. The Tristana was never really in a position to die. Gala was doing a ton of damage in the back half of these team fights. Honestly, there really was just nothing Istanbul could do. RNG played better, and they drafted better, and from that point onwards, it was their game to lose. Xiao, who gets player of the game, but Ming played well on the Amumu. Gala played well on the Tristana. Shout out Breathe, shout out Wei. Everybody on RNG did their part. It's really, really hard for me to talk about this in depth because I feel like I already did this against Isurus. Everybody was good here. For the Wildcats, unfortunately, this means they drop to 0-4 as well with Isurus in that group. They both play each other tomorrow, but all of the top 4 teams here have at least 2 wins, which means that no matter what happens between Isurus and the Wildcats tomorrow, they're both out. They're both not going to be making the best of 5s, which is definitely unfortunate. I wanted to see a better performance from the Istanbul Wildcats, but I talked about this in the Group B predictions. There was such a big gap. I mean, obviously from 1 and 2 down, and then from 3 and 4 down as well. Like, it very much felt like there were tiers of 2 teams each in this group, and it would have taken a pretty big miracle for the Wildcats to be able to overcome any of the teams above them. Even Saigon Buffalo, I don't think was really all that beatable for a team like the Istanbul Wildcats. And so for them to be sitting here at 0-4, it's not really all that surprising, but it's definitely at least a little unfortunate. A lot of credit to the solo laners. They at least tried in this game. Shout out Saren. He had some phenomenal plays towards the back half of this game. Was really keeping Istanbul at least like remotely in it in the back half. Had an ace on RNG where he got a triple kill. He played phenomenally in that fight. Was able to get out, teleport back in with full health and be able to reset the entire momentum of that fight overall. And so Saren really tried his best. And then Starscreen, for as much as he got dominated in laning phase on the Garen, he was able to make a lot of plays outside of the laning phase. Not entirely up to him, but certainly the Garen pick did something in this game, which is more than I expected, and so you gotta give him credit for that. But Ferret, Holy Phoenix, Farfetch'd just simply aren't on the level to be able to compete here. Holy Phoenix is gonna get my dud of the game here. He could have gotten it in multiple games, I think, for Istanbul over the course of this tournament. He really was not good. Him and Farfetch might be one of the worst bot lanes at the tournament. I know I've said that a couple of times about a couple of different teams here, but they certainly underperformed by a considerable amount. Ferret had a couple of good games. This was not one of them on the Maokai. You really need to be able to establish your dominance on the Maokai in terms of map pressure, especially against a pick like Sejuani that theoretically shouldn't be able to compete with you in that regard, but the team, again, was so far behind at that point that there was really nothing that he could do to set things back straight. But you go for a more dive, aggressive-oriented comp in the bot lane. Samira set for that full engage, and it just does not work out. Farfetch was maybe the worst support at the tournament. Holy Phoenix definitely had some awful games as well, so just not a lot you can talk about for the Wildcats. Really a game that was disappointing, and I think a tournament that was disappointing. I know someone brought this up, but how bad's it gotta feel for you as a region to only get to play, like, 1 or 2 international tournaments a year and play against some of the best teams, and that's it? Like, you have this big crowning achievement, you go through this entire year of building in order to play at an international tournament to represent your country, and then you're just not remotely on that same level. Like, it just feels a little disappointing. Kind of leans into the fact that we should just have more international tournaments around the year, or at least more varied international tournaments, just so that a lot more teams can at least get the experience of playing some best of fives, because like the TCL as a region, just not even going to get the chance to play best of 5. The LLA as a region, not going to get the chance to play a single best of 5 this year internationally. And I just think that's a little bit unfortunate. Not that these teams obviously deserve to play against some of the better ones. They had their shot in group stage here, but just generally speaking, I think the more best of 5s we can give some of these regions, the better for their development and yada, yada, yada. Now I'm just getting into theoretical stuff. For Istanbul, they have a chance, and honestly, I do think they're better than Isurus. They'll probably end this tournament sitting at 1-4, but unfortunately, that's not going to be good enough to get them out of the bottom cellar of this group. Holy Phoenix and Farfetch couldn't show up. Starscreen didn't have as good of a tournament as I wanted him to. It was really just Saren who showed up and was kind of as good on the world stage as he was in region, and unfortunately, that just wasn't going to be enough for the Wildcats. So hopefully they can win tomorrow and end their world's journey on a positive note, but it's all going to be for naught at the end of the day. And then for RNG, I mean, you're just so good. You can make a real case this is still the best team in play-ins, even though they lost to DRX. We'll get into that conversation when we talk about DRX in a bit, but RNG's just ridiculous. I mean, they're a team that is way too good to be playing a TCL team, and they show that pretty consistently. They obliterate Isurus, they obliterate the Wildcats. These bottom teams in the group absolutely stood no chance, and RNG just really looked like they were going through the motions. Hopefully at this point, now that we've gotten all the easy games out of the way, we can start getting to some of the ones where RNG actually has to try. Potentially they might even have to play a best of 5, and that's where I think it'll start to get interesting for this roster. That's going to bring us to our 8th and final game here of day number 3, and it was a battle between a winless team and an undefeated team, so I think a lot of you could probably have guessed how this one was going to go from moment 1, but you got Isurus Gaming 0-3 taking on DRX at 3-0. And DRX just continues to look like the best team in play-ins. I know I just talked about RNG potentially being the best team in play-ins, and everybody would have thought it would have been RNG, but obviously DRX able to take care of RNG. And even outside of that, like even if you just look at their matches against the minor region teams, DRX is beating them more than RNG. I know RNG obliterated Isurus. DRX just won in 22 minutes. I think if you, have they had a 25-minute plus game that wasn't against RNG? Like, I don't actually know if that's true. I know they won yesterday in at least one game that was like 23, 24 minutes. Like, they are absolutely obliterating everyone that they come across in this tournament, and it's so fun to watch. It's so satisfying to watch as someone who's been watching the LCK all year, seeing the highs that DRX has been able to produce. Obviously, the lows have certainly been there for this team as well, but we always knew that if this team was playing at their absolute best like we knew they could, they were one of the best teams in the world. We knew it when this roster was constructed, and it certainly played out like that. Maybe not in the same way that we all thought it would, but it certainly played out like that because, and I almost am tired of talking about it, which is crazy for me because he's one of my favorite players in the world. I've talked about him for 7,000 hours on this channel over the course of the LCK split when people were underestimating him in the LCK. I talked about him in the LCK playoff primer that I did when I put him as my second team all-pro mid laner. And now I'm talking about him because he's clearly been the best player at Worlds, and it's not even all that close. Zika in the mid lane has just been unbeatable. He really is genuinely unbeatable in the mid lane. He is that good. There is no minor region team that is going to walk in to DRX and not just straight lose to Zika. That's just what happens. He picks up the Yone in this game. They flex the Silas into the top lane. Really like this draft overall from DRX. I think this gives you a lot of options. Obviously, double melee with Sejuani is always fun, but especially when that's Silas and Yone too that can really take advantage of that damage threshold. With no Aatrox in there, that's probably the most damage that you could possibly give this combo, and man, did they execute on this. Zika styling on absolutely everybody on the enemy team. Nobody can even touch him. Grell tries to gank a couple times. That is a mistake, because it's not like he's ever gonna die, and obviously DRX has now learned to invest in Zika. That's kind of been their strategy that's gotten them over the hump, because he is their best player, and Pioshik and the entire coaching staff, I think, has realized that as they've really started to invest in him a lot in the early game, making sure that he is in a position to be able to carry these games. Pioshik does a lot on the Sejuani to make sure he's in that spot, and by mid-game, it's just over. Like, no one can touch him, and that's felt like it's been every single game for DRX. You draft Maokai or Sejuani, mostly Maokai in the jungle. You make sure that Zika's in a position to be on a carry, the Akali, the Yone, even the LeBlanc or the Silas, or whatever he ends up wanting to play that game. And you make sure that he's in a position that by 10-15 minutes, he's so far ahead that the game is over. That's been the script every game, and it's worked. He is player of the game again. He's gotten player of the game in all 4 of their games for me. He's been that good. There's nothing I can say about him that I haven't said in the last 2 videos. Right now, he's playing like one of the top 10 players in the world, and he genuinely could be in that category. I had Xiaohu as my number 6 player going into this tournament. Zika has been better than Xiaohu by a considerable margin. So, I don't know what that says, but right now he is legit playing like a top player, like a top 10 player in the world. If he keeps this up, DRX is going to surprise a ton of people and make my prediction of them being hyper competitive in that Group C incredibly accurate. But it's more than just him. I mean, Kingen, Pioshik, Deft, Beryl all played well. Deft and Beryl, obviously, in the bot lane, the big names of this team, a former world champion and Deft in the bot lane is always big. Beryl certainly has his moments. Definitely had a little bit of a troll start to this game where he misses the point-blank bandage toss in the invade and then flashes to steal the kill, but it's fine overall. Like, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because they're able to stomp lanes so hard. Curse of the Sad Bullet Time is so amazing, and it's not like Deft and Beryl are going to fuck that up. And then you have Kingen and Pioshik on this team, and Kingen gets flexed to Silas. We know he's kind of good at playing these weird mages in the top lane. He always has been. That's been his biggest perk, even if he's not the most consistent top laner in the world. Like I said, throughout most of the year, I think 2022 was probably his best year in the LCK, and I think he proved that at Worlds so far, that he's been able to go up against some of the better tops and hold his own. Pioshik, Juhan, whoever's in there, they both play very similar styles right now, which is ironic, because I don't think they're very similar players, but the Maokai, the Sejuani, these more facilitative junglers that they can play a little bit more proactive on in the early game because they don't have to risk being caught out nearly as heavily, have been super duper huge for this team. Obviously, Pioshik and Beryl at multiple points throughout the season felt like anchors to this DRX team that were weighing them down and were going to be the reason they missed Worlds. Juhan came in during the LCK regional finals and really felt like he brought this team together in a way that Pioshik couldn't, but Pioshik back in here, obviously both of them have been practicing and have been learning, and on these more supported picks, the Maokai, the Sejuani, this team feels unbeatable because they're not able to get around this jungle gap. Their macro is too good, they're going to be in the right spot, and so overall, just a lot of huge, major positives for this DRX team. It's really hard to imagine a world in which they do not come out of this group as number 1 at this point, but the Mad Lions game tomorrow is certainly going to be interesting. As for Isurus, it's definitely a sad way to drop to 0-4 and to lose your shot at making best of 5s, but nobody was really expecting this team to make best of 5s. Even someone like an Istanbul Wildcats, like in a crazy scenario, if a team like Saigon Buffalo wasn't nearly as good as I thought they were, could like theoretically make that top 4. I don't think there was really any universe in which people were expecting Isurus to make it. They were my last ranked team at Worlds, and quite frankly, they played like it. They were not all that competitive in any of the games so far. Their best player, Grell, really wasn't like all that good in this game, and that definitely needs to happen. Pioshik definitely out-jungled him in pretty much every opportunity. He's unfortunately my dud of the game on the Viego here, but he has had a good tournament. It's hard to take that away from him. Seiya, who was probably their best player in region, like in their actual region, just hasn't been the takeover player that they need. Again, a lot of people on broadcast have kind of said a lot of the things that I was saying going into this tournament. He's a very solid player, but not one that's going to grab advantages. His team kind of has to do that for him. That's why I thought him and Grell made a very good jungle mid duo, because Grell is very aggressive, but the rest of this team is just not up to snuff. ADD, Gavoto, Jelly, they're just not Worlds caliber players. I don't mean to be rude, but they've proven that at this tournament. They take the Maokai away here, stick it on ADD. He does pretty much nothing in this game, and obviously the crazy counterpicks, the Zillion, the Teemo that he's been pulling out at this tournament have not been able to work out. I think he relied a lot on those picks to be able to keep up with other Worlds top laners, and they just haven't been able to come to fruition. And then Gaboto and Jelly were not good at this tournament either. Talked about this a little bit earlier as well, but they were never the focal point of this team in the LLA, especially during those finals, and I think that definitely played out here. They give them the Aphelios, and they're really relying on him to be able to do a lot of damage. Obviously, this is a hyper-scaling comp with Aphelios, Azir, Viego, Maokai, all things that really do a lot better in the late-game team fights generally than in the early game, and you can't do that against DRX. They're going to grasp the lead early, and they're never going to give it up, and that's unfortunately what happened here. So, it just seems like Isurus didn't have the talent to be able to compete at this tournament, but they have, like I said, one more shot to be able to not be 0-5 at the end of this tournament by playing the Istanbul Wildcats tomorrow, a battle of the winless. It's certainly going to be interesting to watch. I think Grell really could make a difference in that matchup, and obviously, I'm really excited to see Seiya versus Saren. I think that's going to be a really intriguing mid lane matchup, and the winner of that might just decide the game, but top lane, bot lanes in both of those series certainly haven't lived up to expectations. If either of those can break through, I think that team is probably going to have a better shot of winning that series than the other team, because jungle and mid is a little bit more consistent, at least for both of those teams. And then for DRX, like I said, at this point, they've got a tough challenge with Mad, but the way they've been playing, they should be able to handle them relatively easily. This should be a team that is walking out of groups tomorrow as the #1 seed, but because of that, and knowing it's DRX, if we're sitting here at the end of tomorrow and we have to play a 3-way tie for first place and they end up getting like the 3rd seed or something, I'm certainly not going to be surprised. That's just the DRX that we've gotten all year long. This is a team that at moments have looked like a top 2-3 team in the LCK. At other moments have looked like a bottom 2 team in the LCK. It's definitely up in the air which one we're going to be getting tomorrow, but if the rest of this tournament so far and their current read on the meta are any indicator, they might actually just be one of the best teams at this tournament, and if they can play like this, I'm really, really, really excited to see what they can do in the rest of Worlds. Alright, well that is going to do it for my Worlds Play-Ins Day 3 overview and analysis of all 8 games that we got. We have a much, much clearer picture of everything that's going on right now, in terms of who's going to be making the best of 5s, who is going to be fighting for their life come tomorrow, and potential tiebreakers that we may see. If you guys did enjoy the video, I highly recommend you leave a like. It really does mean a lot to the channel. And so if you got to the end here and you enjoy the analysis and the content that I've been putting out over the course of not only World Season but this entire year, it would really mean a lot to me if you did leave a like there. And let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts, not only on the video, but on these games. What game was your favorite? What players do you think performed and overperformed, underperformed, all the stuff in between, all the good stuff. I love hearing from you guys down in the comment section below. And of course, while you're there, you might as well hit the subscribe button. If you enjoyed this video, I promise you're going to be enjoying all of the content that I'm putting out over the course of Worlds. I'm going to be covering every single day of Worlds in depth on this channel, as in-depth as anybody out there, probably more in-depth than a lot of the other channels out there. That's kind of what I aim for. I want to make sure that you guys get every bit of knowledge that you absolutely can, and I really do hope you guys are enjoying it, and if you are, it really would mean a lot to me if you guys hit the subscribe button and hit the bell. But it's time to move on to my player of the day and my dud of the day. Been a little bit difficult to give out these awards just because it's one day of action, but my player of the day here in day number 3 at Worlds is going to be Wei from RNG. He was absolutely dominant in the jungle matchup in both games. They completely obliterated both of the teams that they played in Isurus and Istanbul, and Wei was a big part of that. He was able to carry a lot of the mid game for the RNG team in both of those matchups. And then my dud of the day, unfortunately, is going to go to Alidoric on Chiefs. I really wanted to see more from Alidoric. He was probably my favorite player, the player I was most looking forward to seeing on the world stage for Chiefs coming into this, and unfortunately, it just doesn't seem like he's been able to hold up. And it's not entirely his fault, but mental and everything, it just doesn't seem like that team is entirely there right now, and it's very unfortunate to watch. Hopefully, he can get another shot either in OS next year or potentially in North America. He played definitely well enough to get an academy spot or potentially a low LCS spot, so would love to see something happen there. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.